Section 15 of Thoughts on Art and Life. Thoughts on Science. Part 3. Experience the basis of science. 54. In explaining the action of water, remember to cite experience first and then reason. 55. Do not forget that you must put forward propositions adducing the above, mentioned facts as illustrations, not as propositions. That would be too simple. 56. Water in itself has no stability and cannot move of its own accord, save to descend. Water of its own accord does not cease to move unless it is shut in. 57. The body of the earth, like the body of animals, is intersected with ramifying veins, which are all united and constructed for the nourishment and life of the earth and of its creatures. Water is the blood of the world. 58. The water which rises in the mountains is the blood which keeps the mountain alive, and through this conduit or vein, nature, the helper of her creatures, prompt in the desire to repair the loss of the moisture expended, proffers the desired aid abundantly, just as in a stricken spot in man you will see, owing to the aid which is brought, the blood abound under the skin in a swelling, so as to succor the spot which has been stricken. Likewise, in the case of the vine, when it is cut at its extremity, nature causes its moisture to rise from the lowest root to the end of the extremity which has been cut, and when this moisture has been expended, nature ceases not to supply it with vital moisture to the end of its life. 59. Water is that which is given to supply vital moisture to this arid earth, and the cause which propels it through its ramifications against the natural course of weighty matter is the same which stirs the humours in every kind of animal body. Water on mountains. 60. Water, the vital moisture of the earthly machine, moves by reason of its natural heat. On the water of rivers. 61. Rivers, with their ruinous inundations, seem to me the most potent of all causes of terrestrial losses, and not fire, as some have maintained, because the violence of fire is exhausted where there is nothing forthcoming to feed it. The flowing of water, which is maintained by sloping valleys, ends and dies at the lowest depth of the valley, but fire is caused by fuel and the movement of water by incline. The fuel of fire is disunited, and its damage is disunited and isolated, and fire dies where there is no fuel. The incline of valleys is united, and damage caused by water is collective, along with the ruinous course of the river, until with its valley it winds into the sea, the universal base and sole haven of the wandering waters of rivers. But what voice or words shall I find to express the disastrous ravages, the incredible upheavals, the insatiable rapacity, caused by the headstrong rivers? What can I say? Certainly I do not feel myself equal to such a demonstration, yet by experience I will try to relate the process of ruin of the rivers which destroy their banks and against which no mortal bastion can prevail. 62. The recesses of the bottom of the sea are perennial, the summits of mountains are transitory, whence it follows that the earth will become spherical and covered with waters, and will be uninhabitable. Transformations in past and future. 63. The shores of the sea continually increase in soil towards the middle of the sea. The cliffs and promontories of the sea are continually being ruined and consumed. The Mediterranean seas will dry up, and all that will remain will be the channel of the greatest river which enters into them. This will flow to the ocean, and pour out its waters together with that of all the rivers which are its tributaries. On the earth's vibration. 64. The subterranean courses of water, like those which are made between the air and the earth, are those which continually consume and deepen the beds of their currents. The earth which is carried by rivers is discharged at the end of their course, that is to say, the earth carried from the highest part of the river's course is discharged at the lowest depth of its course. Where fresh water arises in the sea, the miracle of the creation of an island is manifest, which will be discovered sooner or later in proportion as the quantity of water is greater or less. And an island of this kind is formed by the deposit of earth and stones made by the subterranean current of water in the channels through which it passes. Nature's Law. 65. Nature never breaks her laws. 66. Nature is constrained by the cause of her laws which dwells inborn in her. 67. Without reason no effect is produced in nature. Understand the reason, and you will not need experience. Cause discovered by effect. 68. Before I proceed further, I will make some experiments, because it is my intention to cite the experiment first, and then to demonstrate by reasoning how such an experiment must necessarily take effect in such a manner. And this is the true rule by which investigations of natural phenomena must proceed, and although nature herself begins from the reason and ends in the result, we must pursue the contrary course and begin, as I said above, from experience, and by it seek out the reason. Repetition of experiment. 69. Before deducing a general rule from this case, repeat the experiment 2 or 3 times and see if the same results are produced. Example of preceding rule. 70. If several bodies of equal weight and shape are dropped one after another at equal intervals of time, the distances between each successive body will be equally increased. The experiment to prove the above-mentioned theorem respecting motion must be made thus. Take 2 balls of equal weight and shape and let them fall from a great height, so that, when they start falling, they touch one another, and let the investigator stand on the ground and watch whether the contact is maintained during their fall. This experiment must be repeated several times, so that the trial may not be marred by any accident, and the experiment vitiated and the spectator deceived. Necessity of analysis. 71. We know definitely that sight is infinitely swift and in an instant of time perceives countless shapes, nevertheless it only sees one object at a time. Let us take an example. You, O reader, will see the whole of this written page at a glance, and you will instantly realize that it is full of various letters, but you will not realize at that moment what these letters are, nor what they signify. Wherefore you will have to proceed word by word and line by line to take cognizance of these letters. Again, if you wish to reach the summit of a building, you must mount step by step, otherwise it will be impossible for you to reach the summit. And therefore I say to you, whom nature has drawn to this art, if you wish to attain to a thorough knowledge of the forms of objects, you will begin by studying the details, and not proceed to the second until you have committed the first to memory, and mastered it in practice. And if you do otherwise, you will be wasting your time and protracting your studies. And remember first of all to acquire diligence, which signifies speed. Vision. 72. Of the nature of the eye. Here are the forms, here the colors, here the form of every part of the universe are concentrated in a point, and that point is so great a marvel. O marvelous and stupendous necessity! Thou dost compel by thy law, and by the most direct path, every effect to proceed from its cause. These things are verily miracles. I wrote in my Anatomy how in so small a space the visual faculty can be reproduced and formed again in its whole expanse. 73. In many cases one and the same thing is attracted by two violent forces, necessity and power. The water falls in rain, and by necessity the earth absorbs the humidity. The sun causes it to evaporate, not of necessity, but by power. Unconscious reasoning. 74. The pupil of the eye in the air expands and contracts according to every degree of motion made by the sun. And with every dilation or contraction the same object will appear of a different size, although frequently the relative scale of surrounding circumstances does not allow us to perceive these variations in any single object we look at. The eye. 75. The pupil of the eye dilates and contracts in proportion to the variety of bright and dark objects which are reflected in it. In this case, nature has afforded compensation to the visual faculty by contracting the pupil of the eye when it is offended by excess of light, and by causing it to dilate when offended by excess of darkness, like the opening of the purse. And nature here behaves like the man who has too much light in his house and closes half the window, or more or less of it according to need. And when night comes he opens the window altogether so as to see better inside his house. And nature here adopts a continued process of compensation, by continually regulating and readjusting the expansion and contracting of the pupil in proportion to the aforesaid obscurity and light which are continually reflected in it. Water surrounding the globe spherical. 76. When you collect facts relating to the science of the motion of water, remember to place under every proposition the uses to which it may be applied, in order that this knowledge may not be fruitless. 77. This is a difficult question to answer, but I will nevertheless state my opinion. Water, which is clothed with air, desires naturally to cleave to its sphere, because in this position it is without gravity. This gravity is twofold: the gravity of the whole, which tends to the center of the elements, and the gravity which tends to the center of the waters of the spherical orb. If this were not so, the water would form half a sphere only, which is the sphere described from the center upwards. But I see no means in the human mind of acquiring knowledge with regard to this. We must say, as we say of the magnet which attracts iron, that such a virtue is an occult property of which there is an infinite quantity in nature. 78. In the motion of earth against earth, the repercussion of the portion struck is slight. Water struck by water eddies in circles round the spot where the shock has taken place. The reverberation of the voice continues for a great distance through the air, for a greater distance through fire. The mind travels for a still greater distance through the universe, but since it is finite it does not penetrate into infinity. 79. If the water which rises on the summits of the mountains comes from the sea, whence it is propelled by its weight to a greater height than that of the mountains, why has this portion of the element of water the power to elevate itself to such an altitude, and to penetrate the earth by so great an expenditure of labor and time, when the residue of the element of water, whose only obstacle is the air which does not impede it, is not able to raise itself to a similar altitude? And thou who didst devise this theory, go and study nature, so that thou mayst cease to acquire such opinions of which thou hast made so great a collection, together with the capital and interest which thou dost possess. On the law of gravity. 80. The sphere of the earth has gravity which increases in proportion to the lightness of the element which contains it. Fire is light in its sphere, and its lightness increases in proportion to the weight of the element which contains it. No primary element has gravity or lightness in its own sphere. 81. The motion made by bodies which possess gravity to the common center is not produced by the tendency of the body to find this center, nor is it caused by attraction made by the center, as by a magnet, drawing the weight towards it. 82. Why does not the weight remain in its place? It does not remain because it has no resistance. And whither will it tend? It will tend to the center of the earth. And why not along other lines? Because the weight which meets with no resistance will descend by the shortest way to the lowest depth, and the lowest depth is the center of the earth. And how does a weight find the center of the earth with such directness? Because it does not proceed at random, wandering by diverse courses. Phenomena governed by mechanical laws. 83. Instrumental science, that is to say, mechanics, is the most noble and most useful of sciences, inasmuch as by means of it all living bodies which have movement act, and this movement has its origin in the center of gravity which is placed in the middle, dividing unequal weights, and it has dearth and wealth of muscles, and lever also, and counterlever. 84. Since these things are far more ancient than letters, it is no wonder if in our day no records exist to tell how these seas filled so many countries. But if some record had existed, conflagrations, floods, wars, changes of tongues and laws have consumed all that is ancient. Sufficient for us is the testimony of objects born in the salt waters and found again in the high mountains far off from the seas of those times. Heat the vital principle. 85. Heat causes moisture to move, and cold arrests it, as is seen in a cold country which arrests the motion of the clouds in the air. Where there is life, there is heat. Where there is vital heat, there is movement of moisture. Against those desiring to correct nature. 86. The act of cutting out the nostrils of a horse is a piece of ludicrous folly, and the foolish indulge in this practice as though they considered nature had failed to supply necessary wants, and man had therefore to supplement her work. Nature made 2 apertures in the nose, which each in itself is half as large as the lung pipe whence breath proceeds, and if these apertures did not exist, the mouth would abundantly suffice for breathing purposes. And if you said to me, why has nature thus provided animals with nostrils if respiration through the mouth is sufficient, I would answer that nostrils are made to be used when the mouth is employed in masticating its food. Of trees. 87. If a tree has been stripped of its bark in some spot, nature makes provision for this, and gives a greater supply of nourishing sap to the stripped portion than to any other, so that in place of what has been taken away, the bark grows thicker than in any other spot. And so impetuous is the motion of the sap, that when it reaches the spot which is to be healed, it rises higher like a bounding ball, in bubbles, not unlike boiling water. The leaves of plants. 88. Nature has so placed the leaves of the last shoots of many trees that the 6th leaf is always above the first, and thus in continued succession unless the rule is obstructed. And this she has done for 2 useful purposes in the plant. Firstly, since the branches and the fruit of the following year spring from the bud or eye which is above and in contact with the juncture of the leaves, the water which feeds the shoot may be able to run down and nourish the bud, through the drop being caught in the hollow whence the leaf springs. And the second advantage is that as these buds shoot in the following year, one will not be covered by the other, since the 5 shoots spring on 5 different sides. End of section 15.